All right, guys. So we're going to start talking about our next unit, talking about cognition, um, the process of building memories. And when we're talking about memories, we're talking about the uh, the internal record and representation of the information that you've learned and the experiences that you've had. Okay. Um, and memory, basically, there's three kind of main phases to memory. We're looking at encoding, which is the process of taking in the information into your memory system. Storage is the retention of that information, and then the retrieval of getting that information out of your memory, to be used, in some practical purpose. Um, so, think about like a computer. You're on your Word document or whatever, and you go to file save. That would be encoding, and then you save it to like a certain folder, and it being in that folder there is the storage, and then we need to go back, click on it, and it brings it back up. That's the retrieval. Okay, so taking the experiences that you have, the sensory data that you're taking in, encoding it, putting it into your memory, having it stored there, and then being able to retrieve that information again, for whatever use you have for it. Okay, so for this particular module, we're looking mostly at the encoding process um, of taking in the information to be part of your memory. Okay, so we're looking at memory. There's basically three main kind of phases. So you have your sensory memory, you have your short-term memory, and you have your long-term memory. Okay, your sensory memory is constantly, like, you're constantly taking in uh, input. Okay, from what you're seeing, what you're hearing, all this kind of stuff. Even if you're not really conscious of it as you're walking around, as you're kind of going about your day, even if you're doing a task, you're still, like, your senses are still taking in information. Okay, most of it is filtered through and then deleted. Think about how much do you remember exactly of what happened yesterday. You were probably awake for, I don't know, 15 hours at least. How much of that 15 hours of consciousness do you actually remember? Not much of it. Okay, so most of it is just kind of filtered out. Anything that's novel, that for whatever reason you kind of focus on, um, either consciously or unconsciously, that then can get moved into short-term memory, and then if you really, really, really purposefully go in and encode it, it can be moved to long-term memory. So looking at sensory memory first, this is again just this your kind of uh, memory of taking in all this stimuli, and you have your echoic memory, or iconic, excuse me, memory, which is the visual memory. Um, if you remember the little experiment we did with the three words, and you had to kind of, it flashed away, and you could still kind of get that picture of the words and where they were, but just for a few seconds, and then after that it was gone. And then your echoic memory, which is the auditory memory. So both iconic and echoic are sensory memory, very, very brief. Most of it gets deleted almost, just after a couple seconds, and you're not really going to be able to retrieve this. It's not going to be encoded and then and stored and then be available for retrieval later on. Then, if it's something that you're focusing more on, now you can move things to short-term memory. Okay, which is still very, very brief and very, very limited. So this is that 7 plus or minus 2, so somewhere between 5 and 9, bits of information, numbers or letters or whatever, and lasts for a very, very short time. So that's why you have like a phone number that's usually, with the area code, it's a little bit longer. But the number itself is like 7 numerals, because that's something that you could hold in your short-term memory, at least for a time. So if you've ever, again, like, you have to look up that phone number, then like dial it real quick before you forget it, that would be your short-term memory. Then, if it's encoded, it can be brought into the long-term memory. Okay, And your long-term memory is you got it. Whereas both sensory and short-term memory are very limited and can only hold information for a brief amount of time. Long-term memory is limitless. There's never been found a limit of the things you can learn. So if you hear people joke things like, oh, like wasted brain space, and like, I forgot this because my brain has too much information. No, there's no such thing as wasted brain space. You have an unlimited amount of brain space specifically for memory in the long-term memory. And that's ultimately for things, of course, that are important, where we want information to get moved into that long-term memory so that it can then be retrieved at a later date. Okay? So, the process of encoding. It can either be automatic, which is the unconscious encoding of incidental information. That sometimes you just might remember something, you might remember some image, you might remember some event that happened that wasn't particularly important to you, but kind of just got stuck in your brain. That would be automatic processing versus effortful processing, which is you're studying for the AP psychology test. You're like putting your attention and conscious effort into it, and things can flow from one to another. Okay, so you might have been working really really hard on say like practicing a certain musical instrument and learning the notes and that kind of stuff. And then once you reach a certain level, you might start acquiring other information automatically that you're not even really aware of in that encoding process, because you've kind of reached a certain level of skill at it. So automatic processing and effortful processing are kind of the two different types of encoding. So how, encoding is kind of the ultimate goal of school, of getting this information in there, and that, you guys know, all humans really know that can, easier said than done sometimes. Information that you want to get in there, and maybe you think you do, but you take the test and it's like, oh my gosh, I don't remember any of this. So what are some strategies that we can use as you're going throughout your learning process and in school, and then even in life, because hopefully you're still learning new information as you go throughout the rest of your lives. It'd be sad to think that you stop your learning when you're 20, 25 or whatever, then for the next 80 years of life you don't learn anything new. Of course not. You're going to learn some new stuff. So mnemonic devices, memory aids, there's a lot of different types of mnemonic devices, looking specifically at the first letters of words, trying to make things rhyme with one another. Your please excuse my dear Aunt Sally, SOHCAHTOA, some math ones, Roy G. Biv for the colors of the rainbow. So these are just little memory aids that use imagery and organizational devices. So again, having really vivid imagery, having things kind of rhyme, that you can organize them, have little kind of jingles that are easy to remember. Those would all be mnemonic devices. And then the spacing effect, which is really, really important in the acquisition of knowledge. Specifically, we can look at in academic terms for a test. You can't just cram the night before. It is much, much more powerful to space out your studying, or you're trying to learning. If you're trying to learn the guitar and you just sit down for 24 hours straight and try to learn all the chords, it's not going to be as beneficial as an hour a day, an hour a day, an hour a day, an hour a day, and spacing that out will have much, much more success in your attention than trying to just mass all your practice at one time. Okay, so always try to space things out, and especially kind of like for a school application, we review each subject for 10 minutes a day, and 10 minutes a day, and then 10 minutes a day, versus trying to cram for 7 hours the night before a test or something. Not as effective as spacing it out. Okay, and then looking at hierarchies. So if you have and this is where we have things like graphic organizers coming in. Um, you know, really complex information and stuff. Instead of trying to just kind of cram it all in, you can break it down into hierarchies. So you can start with your very broad, overarching concept, and then kind of subdivide it into categories and keep going, so that it's much more useful. So I'm trying to remember all my things about the American Revolution, and oh my gosh, there's so much information. So what can help me is I do American Revolution, and I do battles, and I do people, and I do maybe the economy of it. Okay, so by doing that, and then further subdividing into the battles of Bunker Hill, the battles of Brandywine Creek, the Battle of Yorktown, people, George Washington, Lafayette, can help your encoding process by breaking up into different categories and subcategories. Okay, and then chunking. If you can chunk your information, it makes it much useful. So this information up here, you wouldn't remember at all because it doesn't really mean anything to you. And okay, versus down here, now you have some letters. It's just the same symbols but kind of moved around that kind of have some meaning. But then if I rearrange those letters into nickel, okay, nickels, and then create a sentence, now I can actually, that has been chunked in some meaningful way, I'm going to be able to remember that much more effectively than this thing here. Okay, it doesn't really mean anything to me or make any sense. So those are some encoding strategies. Use those, pay attention to those, use them throughout your academic life, and then beyond that. And we'll look at retention and I can't recall it now. Retention and retrieval. So storage and retrieval in our next video.